is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
On January 1st, 1979, China and the United States established diplomatic relations with each other. 40 years on, bilateral relations have experienced enormous growth despite ups and downs along the way. As we celebrate 4 decades of China-U.S. diplomacy, the feelings are, however, mixed. The trade frictions have undermined bilateral trade ties. Time is running out for trade negotiations against a hard deadline in March. The fate is unknown of a Huawei executive arrested in Canada at the request of the U.S. There seems to be little reason to celebrate. Have the engines behind our diplomacy run amok after 40 years? Are things going to get worse before turning for the better? What has to be done by both sides to keep this relationship on track to ensure global peace and prosperity? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm honored to be joined from Washington, D.C. by His Excellency Chinese Ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai. Ambassador Cui, welcome to The Point.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. And Happy New Year.
It's our pleasure. Happy New Year to you too. First, let's start with the trade war with the very latest on this development. As we know, leaders from China and the U.S. reached consensus at the beginning of December to have a truce on applying additional tariffs on each other and gave their teams 90 days to come to an agreement. Since then, we have seen measures from both sides, although not always pointing to a promising outcome, though. China resumed importing soybeans from the U.S., and yet the arrest of the Huawei CFO has put the U.S.'s sincerity to resolve the trade issue into doubt, at least on the minds of many Chinese people. How do you view the recent developments? Can we be reasonably optimistic that some kind of agreement can be reached in time to save economic relations from further deteriorating?
On December the 1st, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump had a very good meeting in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and they reached important agreement on the overall direction of China-U.S. relationship going forward, as well as on how to deal with the economic and trade issues between us. Now I think the task before us is to implement the agreement between the two presidents in an effective and timely manner. I believe as long as both sides remain committed, as long as both sides make serious efforts on the basis of mutual respect and follow a balanced approach that will address concerns of both sides, we will be able to achieve a mutually acceptable and mutually beneficial outcome.
There has been, or there is rather, some confusion as to whether China would make necessary compromises, and some people doubt Beijing's flexibility to reach an agreement with the U.S. What's your message to them?
Well, I think in order to find a solution to the current problem, in order to implement the agreement between the two presidents, it will require efforts from both sides. This means each has to reach out to the other side. Each has to make its own efforts, or to borrow your words, to make its own compromises. That's why I believe a balanced approach is needed.
What do you mean exactly by a balanced approach? You mean both sides doing something to meet each other midway, or both sides see the issue in a manner?
Yeah, you see there are concerns on both sides. We fully understand the U.S. concerns, and hopefully they are also fully aware of our concerns. And we can only build a strong and a stable economic relationship between the two largest economies of the world if we can address the concerns of both sides and find a win-win solution.
You said hopefully the U.S. can understand China's concerns. Do you think after a couple of months of friction and tit-for-tat tariff actions, do you think that understanding has improved to a certain degree? What about the Chinese side?
I think in a way all these frictions and disputes and back and forth between the two sides also in a way facilitate mutual communication and understanding. At least I certainly hope so.
Now, during our last interview, which was almost exactly 2 years ago, you said any trade war, especially between the largest economies of the world, will be very damaging to both economies and will hurt the global economy as well. Yet, a tariff war, or rather a trade war, still broke out in 2018 and spiraled pretty fast. What is your take on it? What have you been working on ever since as an important caretaker of this relationship?
Well, unfortunately, I've been proved right in making all these assessments. It's quite clear the escalation of trade disputes between our two countries have hurt both economies and have also hurt the prospects of the global economic growth. That's why so many countries, so many people are so concerned, and they really hope that China and the United States can work out something that will ease their concerns.
What have been your main focus so far over the past several months, especially to bring that relationship back on track?
Well, I think teams on both sides have been working very hard to be fair, to address the issues, to try to find a solution. And for people in the embassy and myself, our job is to facilitate communication and coordination between the two sides, and we'll continue to do our best.
Mm-hmm. Do you see certain results coming out of your effort? I understand you also have been giving speeches to the American think tanks, to the general public. How do you see the importance of both tracks at the same time?
Of course, the two economic teams have to intensify their work, and fortunately they have already started after the meeting in Argentina, and they are very deeply engaged with each other. Hopefully they will make some visible progress. But this would also need the understanding and support of the general public, especially maybe the two business communities. So that's what we have been doing, talking to them, making speeches, and having discussion with them, listening to their concerns, try to facilitate communication and coordination.
You have been the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. since March 2013. What have you observed as the underlying factors that could lead to a certain kind of tension between the two sides, like what we have seen over the past year? I understand that there are, for instance, 360,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S., but only less than 12,000 U.S. students studying in China. In my eyes, the imbalance of understanding and interest seems to have become unsustainable. What is your take?
Well, for the overall relationship, I never have the illusion that such a comprehensive and complex relationship between two great countries would always follow a straight line. I never have such an illusion. At the same time, I always have the confidence that in the long run, the common interest of our two peoples would prevail. The voice of reason would prevail. I still have that confidence. And it's very encouraging to see that there's a growing number of Chinese students in America and American students in China. Although the number of American students in China is still smaller than the number of Chinese students in America. But I think both numbers are growing. This is very encouraging. And these young people, they are the true ambassadors for friendship and understanding between our two peoples. They are the bridges between our two countries. Unfortunately, recently we've heard accusations against them, very absurd accusations that are totally unfounded and extremely unfair to them. You see, people making such accusations, I think they must also have had their own younger days. And when they were young, they also had their own aspiration for life. And today they even have their own kids. So how can people have such dark and miserable mindset toward the younger generation today? I really feel sorry for them.
Okay, let's step away from the dark sides of our relationship for just a moment and remember and recall the 40 years of generally positive relationship between the two sides. You talked about when people were young. May I ask you this question? Exactly 40 years ago, when you were young, on that day, January the 1st, 1979, when China and the United States established diplomatic relationship, do you remember where you were? What impressed you on that day? And did you imagine that relationship would have grown so fast and so much, and that one day you would end up being the ambassador for the United States of China?
I certainly remember clearly the day when Mr. Deng Xiaoping arrived in Washington, D.C. I was doing my graduate studies in Shanghai, and at the time, we have no TV at home, so we have to go to a relative's home to watch black and white TV, live coverage of his visit to the United States. It was really eye-opening, and it was very inspiring, I think, for people of both countries. Of course, at the time, I never imagined that I could one day come to the U.S. and even become Chinese ambassador to the United States. So this is a very small personal story, but it also shows that relations between our two countries over the last 4 decades have brought real benefits for people of both countries.
Indeed,
and now,
yeah.
Today, since we are managing this relationship, we should do our utmost to contribute to further development, to a stronger and more sustainable relationship between our two great countries.
Yeah, looking back over the 40 years, how would you describe that journey so far? Can we see several phases of that journey characterized by different atmosphere or priorities for people who haven't closely followed that relationship or lived that period of time?
You see, we are living in a fast-changing world, and over the last 4 decades, the world has gone through profound changes. So have our two countries. So this has brought a lot of opportunities as well as challenges to the bilateral relations between China and the United States. But on the whole, this relationship has been moving forward in the right direction. And one thing is quite clear from our experience in the last 40 years. That is, cooperation is the only right option for both countries. And the key words are coordination, cooperation, and stability.
Okay, although there have been downs, ties have been going up in general, as you said. What are the key factor or factors that have kept the two sides close to each other? Some people say it's common interests in the beginning. For instance, the two were all trying to counter a third rival being the former Soviet Union. Would you say that has been common interests have been the same, the things that have bound the two countries together? What's your opinion?
I think it's quite clear. The common interests and mutual needs between our two countries have brought us together and will continue to do so. Unfortunately, such common interests and mutual needs are still growing. If we look at today's world, there are so many challenges, global challenges. No country can handle all these things all by itself. We have to work with each other. That's why we believe that China, United States, and others in the international community should all work together to build a community of nations with a shared future. And hopefully, China and the United States will be important partners in this common endeavor.
However, has it become more difficult, though, for China, for instance, to accommodate or to support the kind of contribution that you were talking about, or to participate in that contribution? Because, for instance, in terms of climate change, the United States government, federal government, has decided to withdraw from the climate change deal. In terms of the nuclear negotiation on Iran, the U.S. has withdrawn, and also on a host of other issues. It seems that the U.S. does not want to cooperate with China on those issues. What's your perception?
Well, there are always, as you said, ups and downs, twists and turns in the relationship, because this is a very comprehensive and a complex relationship. And sometimes maybe political climate changes faster than natural climate. But still, if we always keep in mind the long-term common interests of our two peoples, the long-term common interests of the world community, I think the choice is clear. We have to cooperate. We have to expand our cooperation and manage possible differences in a very constructive way. So the relations will continue to move forward steadily and stably, not only in the interests of our two countries, but in the larger interest of the entire world.
For the urban elites in the United States, the outcome or the future direction is pretty clear, I would understand. And yet for the grassroots in the Midwest in the United States, for instance, who have been feeling that they have been left out during the process of globalization, there seems to be a perception that China has benefited much more than the United States from our diplomacy. How do you look at that? From the increase of per capita GDP on a national level, it also seems to tell such a story.
Well, if we look at the per capita GDP of our two countries, the per capita GDP of the United States is still much larger than China's. So can we say still the United States has benefited more than China from globalization? But I don't think such a narrow focus is really helpful. You see, all the countries have their domestic problems, have domestic challenges. And maybe all countries need to make economic and social restructuring, or in our words, reform and opening up. China is determined to follow a path of peaceful development. China is determined to continue reform and opening up. Maybe there's a similar need here in the United States. Maybe there's a similar need in other countries. But if we can work together, it will be better. It will be better for all countries, and it will help all countries to achieve its national goals. This is not a zero-sum game. This should be a win-win outcome.
You talked about maybe even in the United States there is the need for reform and opening up. You've said that before, and I always wondered exactly why you say this, because I guess for a lot of people in the Western world this would be quite an unusual idea. What exactly do you mean? What kind of reforms and opening ups are you talking about?
Well, I don't want to make comments on domestic policies of the United States. But you see, since we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up, since we are welcoming the new year, maybe as a New Year gift to my American friends, maybe I could share with them some philosophical idea of Mr. Deng Xiaoping, which is emancipate the mind and seek truth from fact.
Okay. Yeah, let's not talk too much, because sometimes when you say too much, people get confused. Emancipate the mind and seek truth from facts. It is up to the people who listen to these words to contemplate and try to understand them. Basically, this is also a task, still a task for the Chinese people, right, as we move forward to the next phase of our reform and opening up. Looking to the future now, Ambassador Cui.
Of course. Yes.
Looking to the future, do you think the domestic and international factors have gone through profound changes to make a sea change in U.S.-China relationship? For instance, the nationalist populism in the United States, the America First policy, and China being much more developed and also being much more active in offering global public goods and international and involved in international diplomacy. How are these varying, shifting factors impacting our relationship?
Well, people always say foreign policy is an extension of domestic policies. Maybe this is quite true. I think for all countries, including China and the United States, the fundamental task is to govern our own country well. But of course, sometimes big countries like the United States, its domestic politics could have spillover effect on other countries. But as far as China is concerned, we will continue our reform and opening up. We will continue the path of peaceful development. And internationally, we stand for building of a community of nations for a shared future. Mm-hmm. This is very consistent. This is consistent with our domestic policy, with our foreign policy. This is very consistent with the general path China has been following over the last few decades. Hopefully, the United States could reciprocate.
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee, however, bilateral relations improving in the near future, say over the next 2 years? For things to come back on track in the long run, what would have to happen on both sides?
Well, I think the current difficulties or complexities maybe are inevitable. You see, the track for the relationship may not be a straight line. Along the road, there will be ups and downs. So, but if we can work really hard together, I'm sure we'll be able to overcome the difficulties and move the relationship forward, maybe in a more steady and stable way.
Mm-hmm. I would like to use a question from a netizen on Chinese Weibo. What's the biggest variable in our relations now, and how do you think peoples from both sides can prepare themselves for such variable?
Well, I think I never have any doubts that our two peoples, ordinary Chinese and ordinary Americans, they want to make friends rather than making enemies. So if we really keep in mind the real interests of our people, then we should have confidence in the prospects of our relations. But we have to work together. We have to get the understanding and the support of the general public. And our two peoples have to join hands doing this great job.
At the 2018 gala dinner of U.S.-China Business Council in early December, you said there are attempts to disengage our two countries. There are attempts to launch a so-called new Cold War, and there are attempts to start strategic rivalries between our two countries in the name of a so-called 100-year marathon. Do you think these attempts are still gaining traction? And if so, what can we do at this moment?
Well, sometimes people make noises. People advocate their own views. But I don't think that these attempts will succeed in the long run.
Why not?
Because it's against the interests, the fundamental interests of our peoples.
And yet at this moment, we are still seeing very hawkish, very hardline rhetoric, very hawkish policies coming out of the United States. For instance, the arrest of the Huawei executive at the request of the United States in Canada, the race to have the upper hand in technology, and also America's latest Africa strategy announcement seems to make Africa a new friend in this regard. Let me also not forget to mention that there is a bi-party consensus that is said to be emerging, which see China as a strategic rival and a competitor instead of a cooperator. Are you not worried that these factors can push things to a more negative direction in the near future?
Well, as I said earlier, relations between our two great countries have never been very easy. So we are fully aware of the recent developments and we are fully prepared. But still, we believe the long-term interest will dictate the future course of our relations. And there's no other choice than closer communication and coordination, cooperation. Because this will really serve the long-term interests of both countries. And I hope people will not allow themselves to be dominated or misled by the dark side of human nature.
In which court would you say the ball is for U.S.-China ties, and to avoid a real confrontation, what's your expectation from the U.S. and what can the Chinese government and people do in the meantime?
A direct confrontation will hurt both countries. This is absolutely clear. So it will require efforts by both sides to prevent this from happening. And we in China, we are always open to working together with our American friends and colleagues to expand our common interests, to manage the differences, and keep the relations on the right track.
Okay, my last question. Again, 2 years ago, at the end of my last interview with you, you said to me that people should not look at everything through a zero-sum lens. The world is much more complicated and many things are interconnected. And you said you hope that people can have a more sophisticated view of the world, of bilateral relations, and maybe of ourselves. If I asked you for a sentence for the year 2019 and beyond, what would it be?
Well, let me try to have a Chinese phrase, maybe a proverb. That is, cut paths through the mountains, build bridges across the rivers, and stay the course. In Chinese, 逢山开路，遇水架桥，坚定不移向前走. That's my wish for the new year.
Thank you very much. Well heard. Many thanks to my honorary guest, His Excellency Chinese Ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai. Thank you. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.